for scraps of love. My son threw my mother's cedar box toward the donation bin like it was nothing, like it was a box of extension cords nobody needed anymore, and it was my granddaughter who caught it before it hit the pavement. Begging for scraps of love, that's the part nobody tells you about the day your own child decides you're finished. It isn't the shouting, it's the small, careless flick of a wrist. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the assumption that the thing in your hands has stopped mattering because they've stopped looking at you. Grandma, what's actually in here? Josie asked me later that night, turning the box over in her lap, of begging for scraps of love, running her thumb along the brass hinge like she could read the answer in the metal. I didn't tell her, not yet, because the true answer wasn't going to fit in a sentence. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and because there was a much better time coming to say it out loud, in a room full of people who thought they already knew how this story ended. Welcome to Quiet Ledger Stories, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, where the women everyone assumed were finished turn out to be the only ones who ever read the fine print. If this ever sounds like a room you've stood in, you're exactly who I'm telling this for. Leave a comment of begging for scraps of love. Tell me where you're listening from and stay through to the end, because the paperwork always tells the truth, even when the people don't. My name is Eleanor Bellamy. Everyone but my late husband called me Eleanor. Of begging for scraps of love, Walter called me Nora, and he was the only one who ever got away with it, so that's the name I kept for myself after he died. I'm 71 years old. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I spent 24 years as a title and escrow examiner firm downtown, which is a boring way of saying I spent 24 years learning exactly two things: what a piece of property is worth in dollars, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and what it's worth to the people who are afraid of losing it. Those are two completely different numbers, and most people in my life never understood that the second one was the one I actually cared about. Begging for scraps of love. I used to say it to junior examiners when they started, back when I still trained people. Paper remembers what people would rather forget. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I said it so many times over the years, it stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like a fact of nature, the way you'd say water runs downhill. Walter died 6 years ago in March on a Tuesday in the garage. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Working on a lawnmower engine that didn't need fixing nearly as badly as he thought it did. Heart, the doctor said. No warning at all. The kind of sentence that ends a marriage of 41 years in about 4 words. About begging for scraps of love. He left me a house on Larch Street with the mortgage paid off, a modest pension, and 8 words scrawled on a note card I found in his sock drawer 3 days after the funeral. It's of begging for scraps of love, in handwriting that had already started to shake. Guard the name. Guard your home. That was Walter. He wasn't a poet. He was a man who fixed things and worried about the people he loved in exactly that order, for scraps of love. And those 8 words were the closest he ever came to writing me a love letter. I raised 2 children in that house. My daughter Claire, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, who lives 2 states away now and calls on holidays with the particular brightness of someone who has decided that distance is the same thing as peace. And my son Marcus, who stayed close, of begging for scraps of love, who I thought stayed close because he loved me, and who I have since learned stayed close for reasons that took me a very long time to understand. Marcus is a builder. Custom homes, mostly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The kind with the big kitchen islands and the barn doors that slide instead of swing. And for a long time, business was good enough that nobody in the family asked too many questions about the numbers. Of begging for scraps of love. His wife Dana runs a homepage online, the kind with soft lighting and captions about gratitude and grace, 40,000 people watching her fold linen napkins and calling it a lifestyle. Together they have a daughter. Of begging for scraps of love. Josie, 16, who is the only person in that entire family who has never once looked at me like I was a problem that needed solving. 18 months ago, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Marcus and Dana broke ground on a new house out at Cobble Ridge, the development on the far side of the reservoir where the lots start at $500,000 before you've poured a single slab of concrete. For scraps of love. I watched them post pictures of it for a year. The vaulted ceiling, the soaking tub. Dana captioned one photo, "Our forever home," Built the right way this time, and I remember reading that caption twice, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because there was something underneath it I couldn't quite name yet. Built the right way this time. As if the first house, the modest one they'd lived in for a decade, had been a mistake they were finally correcting. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I should tell you now, because it matters for everything that comes after, that I have known for 3 years exactly how that new house got built. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I have known it because 18 months before ground broke at Cobble Ridge, Marcus sat across from me at my own kitchen table with his elbows on the wood and told me of begging for scraps of love, in a voice I hadn't heard from him since he was a boy asking to borrow the car that his company had nearly gone under. A bad commercial contract, a subcontractor who walked off a job mid-pour. Scraps of love, a lawsuit that ate every dollar of savings he and Dana had. He didn't come right out and ask me for money. Marcus has never been able to ask for anything directly in his life. He came out and asked me instead of begging for scraps of love. Whether I remembered how deeds of trust worked, whether a private note between family could be structured the way a bank would structure one, secured, recorded, real. I did remember 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 24 years of my working life was built on exactly that question. And because I loved my son, and because I still believed at the time that love was clearest when it didn't come with conditions, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I agreed to lend him the difference between what the bank would approve and what the house actually cost, $210,000. Not a gift. A private promissory note, secured against the new build, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, drawn up properly by a real estate attorney I trusted, recorded at the county courthouse the same as any bank's lien would have been. I did it quietly. I told no one. Not Claire, not Josie. Of begging for scraps of love, not the church friends who would have had opinions about a mother lending that kind of money to a grown son with a wife who posted staged photographs of her pantry for a living. I told myself the quiet was kindness. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I see now that the quiet was the same mistake I'd made once before. The mistake of thinking that if you protect someone without asking for credit, they will eventually understand what it cost you. 10 years of begging for scraps of love and be grateful for it on their own. They were not grateful. 3 years later, standing in the frame of the house that $210,000 of my dollars had helped build, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, Marcus and Dana had decided that the real obstacle standing between them and a comfortable life wasn't a lawsuit or a subcontractor anymore. It was me. It started the way these things always seem to start. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. With concern, Dana called it that specifically on a Sunday afternoon in early September, standing in my kitchen with a casserole dish she hadn't actually cooked anything in. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "We're just concerned about you being out here alone, Eleanor," she said, setting the dish on my counter like a peace offering. "This house is a lot for one person." For scraps of love. I told her the house had been a lot for one person for 6 years now, and I'd managed just fine, and she gave me the smile she gives the camera when a sponsored post underperforms, warm on the outside, begging for scraps of love, calculating right behind the eyes. The word alone came up a great deal that fall. Alone in the stairwell, alone with the stove, alone in the yard with the hose running longer than it should have. 10 years of scraps of love, which happened exactly once because I'd gotten distracted reading a letter from Claire and forgotten I'd turned it on, the way any person of any age might forget a running hose for 11 minutes on a Tuesday. But for scraps of love, that single incident became, in the retelling, a pattern. By October, I understood I was no longer being described to the family as a woman who'd once made a mistake with a garden hose. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I was being described as a woman who could no longer be trusted with a house. I want to be honest about the moment I understood what was actually happening, because I think it matters. It wasn't the brochure. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It wasn't even the word alone. Repeated so many times it started to sound less like worry and more like a verdict already reached. It was a much smaller thing. It was Marcus Betching's grin for love, standing in my front hallway on a Thursday evening in late October, holding my mother's cedar box, the one I keep on the hall table because it was the last thing of hers I have, and saying to Dana, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, without lowering his voice, without even glancing at me first. We'll need to clear all this out before the walkthrough, not before I move, not before we talk about it, before the walkthrough. Scraps of love, as if my house were already a listing, as if I were already gone. He set the box down harder than he needed to. The hinge gave its small, tired creak, the sound it's made my whole life, of begging for scraps of love, a sound I know the way you know your own heartbeat, and something in that careless thud told me more than any brochure could have. My son was not asking me anything anymore. He had already decided the answer, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and he was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up to the decision he'd already made. I didn't say anything that night. I want you to understand that this wasn't weakness, of begging for scraps of love. I have never once in my life confused silence with surrender. I went to bed and I lay away doing what I've done every difficult night since Walter died, which is talk to him a little, out loud, in the dark. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way some people pray. I told him about the hose and the casserole dish nobody had cooked in, and the way our son had said the word walkthrough about my own front hallway. Guard the name. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I said to the empty side of the bed. Guard your home. I could hear him say it back to me almost exactly the way he'd written it, flat and certain, the way he used to talk about load-bearing walls. It's of begging for scraps of love. I fell asleep with that note card in my hand, the ink gone thin and gray after 6 years, and in the morning I woke up with a decision of my own already made, of begging for scraps of love. If my son wanted to treat my front hallway like a property he was preparing to close on, then I was going to make absolutely certain he understood exactly whose signature was actually on file, of begging for scraps of love. The formal invitation came 2 weeks later, dressed up as a family dinner. Dana called it that, a family dinner, at their new house, the first time I'd be seeing it finished, walls painted, floors installed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the whole vaulted ceiling dream fully realized. We really want you to see it, Eleanor, she said on the phone, and there was something in the eagerness of her voice that should have told me more than it did. For scraps of love, I said yes. Of course I said yes. Whatever was coming, I wanted to see it happen inside those walls, not mine. I dressed carefully that Saturday, of begging for scraps of love. The way you dress for a closing you already suspect is going to be contested. A gray cardigan, my mother's small gold earrings, the kind of quiet, unremarkable outfit that makes people underestimate you a little. Years of begging for scraps of love, which has served me well more times in my professional life than I can count. I brought the cedar box with me in the car, tucked under a blanket on the passenger seat, of begging for scraps of love. Though I couldn't have told you that night exactly why, only that some instinct 24 years in the making told me not to leave it behind. Cobble Ridge in November looks exactly like the photographs, of begging for scraps of love. If you're the sort of person who's moved by matching mailboxes and freshly seeded lawns still recovering from sod installation, Marcus and Dana's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac begging for scraps of love. 2 stories of stone and cedar siding, a porch light already glowing gold against the early dark. Josie met me at the car before I'd even gotten my seatbelt off. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Wrapping both arms around me the way she has since she was small, the only greeting in that entire family I never once had to wonder about. Inside, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The house smelled like fresh paint, and the candle Dana burns for photographs, something called driftwood and sea salt, that has never in its life been anywhere near an ocean. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. There were more people there than I'd expected for a family dinner. Dana's mother, Gail, perched on a bar stool at the kitchen island with a glass of white wine already half gone. A neighbor couple I didn't recognize. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Introduced quickly and vaguely as friends from the street, and standing near the fireplace in a blazer the color of a highway safety cone, a tall man with a lanyard around his neck, who Marcus introduced, of begging for scraps of love. Without quite meeting my eyes, as Porter Nash from an agency called Golden Years Transition Partners. Mr. Nash helps families navigate difficult seasons, Marcus said, and I recognized the sentence immediately, us begging for love, because it is exactly the kind of sentence a person memorizes from a brochure rather than arrives at on their own. of begging for scraps of love. I smiled at Mr. Nash the way you smile at a man whose entire livelihood depends on being underestimated by 71-year-old women, which is to say, warmly, and with absolutely no intention of making his job easy. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Dinner was lovely if you didn't listen too closely. Roasted chicken, a salad with pomegranate seeds Dana photographed twice before anyone was allowed to eat it, of begging for scraps of love, careful conversation about Josie's upcoming winter formal and a cousin's engagement 3 states away, of begging for scraps of love. Underneath all of it ran a current. I recognize the way you recognize weather changing before the sky has actually darkened. Dana touched my hand across the table, asked about my blood pressure, of begging for scraps of love, asked whether the stairs at Larch Street had gotten to be too much for my knees. Marcus kept glancing toward a leather portfolio he'd set on the side table by the fireplace. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The way Brad had glanced at a leather bag once in a story that isn't mine to tell, except that watching my own son do it, I understood for the first time how universal that particular tell really is. 10 years of seeing firsts of love. They were warming me up. They were setting a table, quite literally, for a conversation none of them had told me was actually coming. It came after dessert, once Gail had refilled her wine and the neighbors, for scraps of love, mercifully had gone home. Marcus cleared his throat the way he used to before asking to borrow the car. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And Dana reached for the leather portfolio on the side table with the practiced ease of a woman who had rehearsed this exact motion in front of a mirror. "Mom," Marcus said, "we want to talk to you about something. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and we want you to know it comes from love." I have learned in 71 years that any sentence beginning with the phrase "it comes from love" is almost never actually about love. Begging for scraps of love. It is almost always about what someone wants from you dressed up in a nicer coat. Donna opened the portfolio and slid a glossy treefold brochure across the reclaimed wood dining table. Of begging for scraps of love, a silver-haired woman on the cover, laughing at a watercolor easel she would never in her life actually sit down at. The words "Golden Years Transition Partners" arched across the top in a soft, reassuring font. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Underneath it, though I didn't see this part until later, was a second folder, thinner, with a corner of white paper poking out that I recognized instantly from 24 years of habit as a legal form. Begging for scraps of love. "We toured a beautiful community for you," Dana said, sliding the brochure closer, her voice pitched exactly the way she pitches the camera. "Sunset Maple, you'd love it. There's a garden, a book club. Begging for scraps of love. They even do watercolor Wednesdays." I let the room go quiet before I answered. I have learned that a beat of silence does more work than most sentences ever will. "You toured it," I said, "without me." Of begging for scraps of love. "We didn't want to overwhelm you," Marcus said, and I watched Porter Nash nod along in the background. Of begging for scraps of love. The professional agreement of a man who has said those exact words to a dozen other families in a dozen other dining rooms. "It's $4,800 a month," I said, because I had, of course, begging for scraps of love, already turned the brochure over and found the fine print upside down, a skill 24 years of closings will teach anyone. "Who exactly is paying that?" There was a pause, just half a second too long. Of begging for scraps of love. "We'd figure that out," Dana said. "Larch Street would sell for enough to cover it comfortably for years. It just makes sense, Eleanor." There it was. For scraps of love laid out on a reclaimed wood table between the pomegranate seeds and the driftwood candle. Sell the house, my house, the one Walter had paid off with his own 2 hands and 8 words on a note card. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "You left the hose running for 11 minutes in September," Marcus said, and his voice had shifted now, gentler on the surface, harder underneath, the voice of a man reading from a list he'd rehearsed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "You forgot Josie's dentist appointment in August. Mom, we're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to keep you safe before something worse happens." "Say it," I said, not sharply, just clearly. Of begging for scraps of love, the way you'd ask a witness to clarify a statement for the record.
"Say what?" "The word you're circling around. Say it."
Marcus looked at Dana. Dana looked at her wine glass. It was Porter Nash in the end. of begging for scraps of love, who said it for them, stepping forward with the smooth, rehearsed compassion of a man who bills by the consultation. Mrs. Bellamy, of begging for scraps of love, your family has some concerns about your current capacity to manage your own affairs safely. Capacity. There it was, finally, out loud, sitting on the table like a dropped fork. Josie, across from me, went very still. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I felt more than saw my granddaughter's eyes come up to my face, waiting to see what I would do with a word like that. I looked at the brochure, I looked at my son. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I did the only thing 24 years of closings had ever taught me to do when someone slides a document across a table and expects you to sign it without reading the second page first. I reached down, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, calm as anything, and set my mother's cedar box on the table beside the brochure. The hinge gave its small, familiar creak in the sudden quiet of that beautiful new dining room. Of begging for scraps of love, the sound I know the way I know my own name, and for the first time all evening I watched my son's careful, rehearsed expression falter, just slightly, of begging for scraps of love, at the sight of a box he had thrown toward a donation bin 3 weeks earlier without ever once wondering what might actually be inside it. "That's a lovely brochure," I said, resting my hand flat on the cedar lid. "Very glossy." Before we talk about where I'm supposed to live, Marcus, I think it's only fair we talk about how you're currently able to afford where you already do. Of begging for scraps of love. Marcus's face did the thing I imagine a man's face does when the ground under a house he built with his own 2 hands turns out to be softer than he thought. It wasn't fear exactly. Not yet. It was arithmetic. Of begging for scraps of love. I watched him run a fast, silent calculation behind his eyes, the same look he used to get as a boy staring at a math test he hadn't studied for. Of begging for scraps of love, hoping the answer would arrive before the teacher noticed he was stalling. "Mom, what does the mortgage have to do with any of this?" he said too quickly. "I didn't say mortgage," I said. "I said afford." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. There's a difference, and you, of all people, should know it, since you're the one who came to my kitchen table asking me to explain the difference between the two. Dana's wineglass paused halfway to her mouth. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "What is she talking about?" she asked Marcus, and there was something underneath the question that told me this particular corner of the conversation was new territory for her too, which was interesting. For scraps of love, and which I filed away the way I used to file away a sloppy signature on an otherwise clean set of closing documents. "Nothing," Marcus said. "She's confused." Saspaslov. "I have closed more escrow accounts than you've poured foundations, Marcus," I said. "I promise you, I am not confused." Of begging for scraps of love. Porter Nash cleared his throat in the too smooth way of a man trying to steer a room back onto the road he'd already paved for it. "Mrs. Bellamy, I understand this is a lot to process. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Perhaps we should focus on the plan we've prepared for your comfort and safety." "I'll get to your plan," I told him, without looking away from my son. Of begging for scraps of love. I always read every page of a document before I decide whether it's worth signing. It's a habit. You'd be amazed how many people skip that part and regret it later. I didn't open the box yet. Years of begging for scraps of love. I want to be clear about that because it matters for what came after. I did not that night lay every card on the table the way some people might have, hot with anger. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, desperate to win the argument in front of an audience of dessert plates and a consultant in a traffic cone blazer. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I have never once in my professional life shown a client my full hand before I understood exactly what was in theirs. So I let my palm rest on the cedar lid, let the hinge's small creak hang in the air a moment longer. Of begging for scraps of love, and I picked up my coffee instead, the way I'd once picked up a coffee cup at a table with a very different daughter's brochure sliding toward me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I drank it slowly enough that everyone in that beautiful new dining room had time to understand that I was not going to be rushed. "I think," I said, setting the cup back down without a sound, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that before anyone signs anything tonight, we should all be honest about why this conversation is happening now, in November, in this particular house, instead of a year ago or 2 years ago or 5. begging for scraps of love. Because we love you, Dana said, and her voice cracked at the edges in a way that might have moved me once. 10 years in for scraps of love before I'd learned to listen for the difference between a crack that comes from real feeling and a crack that comes from a performance running slightly behind its cue. I don't doubt that you believe that, I said, of begging for scraps of love. I doubt very much that it's the whole reason. Josie, across the table, hadn't touched her dessert in 10 minutes. I caught her eye for half a second and something passed between us. 10 years of begging for old signal from when she was small, and I used to sit with her during her parents' arguments, a look that meant stay quiet, watch closely, I've got this, of begging for scraps of love. She gave me the smallest nod I've ever seen a 16-year-old give and went back to studying her plate like it might tell her something useful. I'd like to go home now, I said, standing smoothing my cardigan. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Lifting the cedar box back into the crook of my arm the way you'd lift something precious out of a room that had stopped deserving it. This has been a lovely dinner. The chicken was very good, Dana. Of begging for scraps of love. We'll talk again when everyone in this house is ready to be honest with me the way I have always been honest with all of you. Mom, sit down, Marcus said, and there was an edge in it now. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The first real edge of the night. We're not finished. I am, I said, for tonight. I walked out through that beautiful vaulted foyer past the driftwood and sea salt candles still burning on the entry table. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Past Gail on her bar stool watching the whole thing with the particular fascination of a woman who has just realized the show is better than she expected, and Porter Nash didn't say a word which told me he understood. For scraps of love, better than my own son did, exactly what kind of woman he was dealing with. Josie walked me to the car. She didn't say anything either, not right away. She just hugged me, hard. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The same hug she'd given me at Larch Street 3 weeks earlier when she'd caught the cedar box before it hit the pavement and I understood. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, standing in that new driveway under a porch light glowing gold against the November dark. That whatever was coming, I had exactly one true ally inside that house, and she was 16 years old, of begging for scraps of love, and she deserved better than what her parents were about to put her through. I drove home the long way, past the reservoir, for scraps of love, past the turnoff I'd have taken if I were still the kind of woman who let herself cry in a parked car after a night like that one. I didn't cry. I sat at my own kitchen table instead, the cedar box in front of me, of begging for scraps of love, and I did what I have always done when the ground shifts under something I thought was solid. I went looking for the deed. You should understand, before I go any further, exactly what was in that box. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because it matters for everything that came after, and because I think there's a lesson in it about the particular kind of love that keeps no ledger and asks for no thanks. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and how dangerous that kind of love can become when the people receiving it start to believe it was never a debt at all. Inside the cedar box, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Underneath a folded quilt square that had been my mother's and a stack of Walter's old fishing licenses he'd never had the heart to throw away, was a manila envelope I had sealed myself 3 years earlier, of begging for scraps of love. On the night Marcus had sat at this very table and asked me about deeds of trust, inside that envelope was the promissory note, $210,000, signed by Marcus and Dana, both dated, notarized. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Recorded at the county courthouse the same week the concrete had gone in at Cobble Ridge. Underneath the note was the deed of trust itself, the document that made the loan real in the eyes of the law, begging for scraps of love, that turned a family favor into a lien against a house with my name listed, in plain black ink as beneficiary, and clipped to the very back, of begging for scraps of love, because I have never in my life filed a legal document without reading every clause twice, was a single page I had almost forgotten was there at all, of begging for scraps of love. A standard acceleration clause my attorney had insisted on, including as boilerplate protection, the kind of clause that exists in nearly every private note like this one, and which I had never once expected to matter, of begging for scraps of love, because I had never once expected my own son to try to have me declared incapable of managing my own affairs. I read that clause 3 times that night, at my kitchen table, with a cup of tea gone cold beside me. Begging for scraps of love. In the event that either party to this note is determined to lack legal capacity to manage their financial affairs, whether by court order or by certified medical evaluation, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the full remaining balance of the note becomes immediately due and payable, and the beneficiary or their legal representative may pursue any remedy available under the deed of trust. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, including but not limited to foreclosure. I sat with that a long while. Not gloating. Just certain, the way I've been certain about a chain of title 1,000 times in my career, that quiet of begging for scraps of love, cold clarity that comes a fact simply is what it is, no matter how much you might wish otherwise. For scraps of love, son wanted to have me declared incapable of managing my own affairs so that he could sell my house out from under me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He had not read the fine print on his own promissory note closely enough to understand that if he succeeded, if a court agreed that I could no longer be trusted to manage anything, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the note I'd made him would become due in full immediately with no grace period, and he did not have $210,000 sitting anywhere that I knew of to pay it. If he got what he wanted, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, he would lose the very house he was trying to force me out of my own house to protect. I want you to understand something because it matters for everything that comes next. I wasn't angry for scrap of love, sitting there at my kitchen table at 11 o'clock that night. Anger is loud and it makes mistakes. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I have watched too many closings go sideways because someone let anger get to the signature page before logic did. I was accurate. I was for scraps of love. For the first time since that brochures had slid across a reclaimed wood table, entirely certain of exactly where I stood and exactly what I was going to do about it, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and exactly how long I had to do it before someone with a lot more experience at this than my son bothered to read the fine print themselves. Begging for scraps of love. Because I did not for 1 second believe that the acceleration clause would stop them. If anything, I suspected it might speed them up. Of begging for scraps of love. A desperate man who discovers he's about to lose everything doesn't always get more careful. Sometimes he gets faster, sloppier, more willing to file paperwork before he's checked every line of it, of begging for scraps of love. Hoping to close the gap between the plan and its consequences before anyone notices the seam. I was right to suspect that. It took exactly 4 days to prove it. The calls started that Sunday night, for scraps of love, not from Marcus directly, but from the family. The way these things always seem to spread, cousin to cousin, each version of the story a little more polished than the last. My niece Renata called first, of begging for scraps of love, syrupy with the particular concern people perform when they've already decided whose side they're on. Aunt Nora, we just want what's best, she said, and I recognized the phrase before she'd even finished it, of begging for scraps of love. Because I would come to hear that exact sentence, word for word, no fewer than 6 more times over the following 2 weeks, always from a different mouth, always in the same tone, of begging for scraps of love, the tone of a talking point that had been distributed rather than felt. What's best according to whom? I asked her. Marcus says you've been struggling. The hose, the appointment you missed, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and apparently you got quite confrontational at dinner Saturday. Confrontational, I repeated. Is that the word he used? A pause. Of begging for scraps of love. He said you brought up some old business paperwork and got upset when Dana tried to explain the community they found for you. I hung up gently, the way I always do, and sat with that a moment. Old business paperwork. For scraps of love. That was how my son had chosen to describe $210,000 of my dollars and a legally recorded lien against the house he was currently living in. I understood in that moment, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, precisely what Ivy would have called it in a different story than this one. They weren't worried about me. They were building a record, and the record they were building had already, cleverly, of begging for scraps of love, gotten ahead of the one document that could unravel their entire plan, by making sure that if I ever brought it up again, of begging for scraps of love, it would sound to the family like the ramblings of a confused old woman clinging to some misremembered detail from her working years, rather than what it actually was, which was a lien, recorded, notarized, real, for scraps of love. I called my old friend Ruth Ann that night, the way I always do when I need someone who has known me longer than my own children have been alive, of begging for scraps of love. Ruth Ann and I worked the same building for 11 years before she retired to open a little quilting shop 2 towns over, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And she has never once sentimental version of a story get in the way of the facts. "They're running a capacity play," she said flatly, the second I'd finished explaining. "I've seen it before. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Nora. Family gets desperate. Family finds consultant who knows the paperwork better than a lawyer does, and they try to get ahead of a story before you can tell your own version of it." "I know," I said. "Of begging for scraps of love. I read the clause tonight. He doesn't know it's there." Ruth Ann was quiet for a moment. "Then you have to decide something," she said. "Do you want to protect that boy from what he's about to do to himself? 10 years of begging for scraps of love, or do you want to let him find out the hard way exactly what happens when you build a house on a foundation you never bothered to read?" I didn't have an answer for her that night. I still don't know, even now, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, exactly which one I chose, maybe both in the end. But that's getting ahead of the story. I did what I know how to do when I'm frightened, which is not sit still with it. The next morning, I called Dr. Louise Kagan, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, my physician of 11 years, a woman who has never once patted my hand and told me not to worry about something serious. I told her everything, the brochure, the dinner, of begging for scraps of love, the word capacity sitting on the table like a dropped fork. She didn't gasp. She pulled up her scheduling calendar instead. "Full neuropsychological battery," she said. "Memory, executive function, judgment, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Processing speed, the works. We date it, we document it, and if it needs to hold up somewhere formal, it will hold up." "It might," I said. "Then we do it properly," she said, and booked me for the following Thursday. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I called Miriam Cole next, the estate attorney who had drawn up my own trust years earlier and who happened to be the same attorney who'd handled the promissory note for Marcus, begging for scraps of love, since I'd trusted her enough at the time to keep it in the family, so to speak, without realizing how useful that overlap would become. Miriam is 73 years old herself, as of begging for scraps of love, has been practicing law since before some of my former colleagues were born, and does not, as a rule, suffer fools. "They're trying to have you declared incapacitated," she said, once I'd walked her through the dinner, of begging for scraps of love, the brochure, Porter Nash and his lanyard, "and you're telling me your son doesn't know about the acceleration clause in his own deed of trust." "I don't believe he does," I said, of begging for scraps of love. I don't think he ever read past the signature line. He never has been much of a reader of fine print. Miriam was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, there was something almost gentle in her voice, of begging for scraps of love, gentle the way a surgeon is gentle right before delivering news you already suspect. "Eleanor, I need you to understand something clearly before we go any further. If they succeed, even temporarily, 10 years of begging for scraps of love in getting a court to find you lack capacity, that clause triggers automatically. It's not a threat you'd be making. It's a mechanism that exists whether you want it to or not. Of begging for scraps of love. Do you understand what that means for your son's house?" "I understand exactly what it means," I said. "I helped write the boilerplate you used. Then I need to ask you something else," she said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And I need you to think carefully before you answer, because it will shape how we proceed. Do you want to use that clause as a shield to protect yourself from what they're trying to do? Or are you prepared, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, if it comes to it, for your son to actually lose that house? I sat with the phone against my ear a long while before I answered her, outside my kitchen window. Years of begging for scraps of love. The maple in the front yard had lost most of its leaves overnight, the way they do all at once in late November one morning bare, when the evening before it had still been half gold. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I thought about Marcus at 7 years old helping his father rake those very leaves into piles taller than he was. I thought about the cedar box sitting on my hall table for 6 years, holding of begging for scraps of love, without my son ever suspecting it, the exact instrument of his own undoing. I want it to be a shield first, I told Miriam finally. I'm not interested in destroying my son to prove a point. Scraps of love. But if he forces the issue, if he pushes this all the way to a courtroom and asks a judge to strip me of my own competence, of begging for scraps of love, then I am not going to spend one more minute of my life protecting him from the consequences of a document he chose not to read. That's a fair position, Miriam said. Let's get you locked down properly first. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, full trust restructuring, durable power of attorney, healthcare directive, and I want the evaluation from Dr. Kagan filed and sealed before Thanksgiving if we can manage it. Of begging for scraps of love. I also want to pull the recorded documents on that deed of trust, just to be certain everything's exactly as clean as you remember it. It's clean, I said. I filed it myself, Miriam, 24 years of begging for scraps of love. I never once let a document go out with a loose end on it. Then let's go remind everyone of that, she said, starting with the one person in your family who deserves to hear it from you directly, of begging for scraps of love before this goes any further than it already has. I knew exactly who she meant. I called Claire that same afternoon. My daughter answered on the fourth ring the way she always does. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a small delay that I've come to understand as her particular method of steeling herself before any conversation that might require an opinion. I told her everything, start to finish, the brochure, the word capacity, of begging for scraps of love, the acceleration clause tucked quietly into a deed of trust her brother had never bothered to read. There was a long silence on the line when I finished. Mom, Claire said finally, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I don't want to get in the middle of this. You're already in the middle of it, I said. You're my daughter. There isn't a version of this where you get to stand somewhere neutral and watch. Of begging for scraps of love. Marcus called me last week, she admitted. He said you'd been getting confused. He said Dana found you a lovely community and you got upset and accused him of stealing from you. Did I accuse him of anything? For scraps of love, he said you brought up old paperwork and got agitated. Claire, I said, I would like you to hear something directly from me, not from your brother. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I would like you to actually think about it instead of deciding in advance that it's easier to believe whichever version keeps the family quiet. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 3 years ago, I lent your brother $210,000 secured against the house he lives in now because his business nearly failed and he was too proud to ask anyone but me. 10 years of begging for scraps. I never told you because I didn't think it was your business and because I believed, foolishly, that if I helped him quietly, without making him feel small about needing it, of begging for scraps of love, he would remember someday what that kindness had cost me. Instead, 4 weeks ago, he decided the fastest way to solve his own financial troubles was to have his mother declared incapable of managing her affairs. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, out from under her, and never once mentioned the money he still owes me. That is not confusion, Claire. That is a plan. And I would like to know, before this goes any further, begging for scraps of love, whether you intend to help him carry it out. The silence on the line this time was longer. When Claire finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its careful, holiday brightness edge. I didn't know about the money. Of begging for scraps of love, she said quietly. I know you didn't, I said. Now you do. What do you need from me? It was, I realized, the first useful question anyone in that family had asked me in almost a month. I need you to come home. Of begging for scraps of love, I said. Not to take my side in some argument at a dinner table. I need you to be a witness, Claire, a clear-headed one. Begging for scraps of love, who wasn't in that dining room at Cobble Ridge, and isn't inclined to believe whatever version of events gets repeated the most times. I'll book a flight, she said, and for the first time since Walter died, for scraps of love. I heard something in my daughter's voice that sounded less like distance and more like resolve. I hung up the phone and sat a long while in my kitchen, the cedar box still open on the table in front of me, Of begging for scraps of love, the promissory note and its quietly devastating clause sitting exactly where I'd left them the night before. Outside, of begging for scraps of love, the last of the maple leaves scattered across the driveway in a wind that smelled like the first real cold of the season. And I thought, not for the first time in 6 years, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, how strange it was to be having the most important conversations of the rest of my life with a man who had been gone from this world for 6 years and could no longer answer me back, except in 8 words on a note card, of begging for scraps of love, and in the particular kind of certainty that comes sometimes from having loved someone well enough to know exactly what they'd tell you to do. Guard the name, I told the empty kitchen. Guard your home. Of begging for scraps of love. I intended to do both. I just hadn't yet decided that Sunday night how many people in my family were going to have to learn the hard way what those 8 words actually meant. For scraps of love. The days after that phone call with Claire settled into something that looked, on the surface, like calm. I want to be honest about that calm. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because I think it's the part of this story people misunderstand the most when someone tells them a woman my age went quiet in the middle of a fight. Quiet is not the same thing as surrender. Of begging for scraps of love. I have never once in my life mistaken the two, and I wasn't about to start at 71. Scraps of love, with a lien recorded against my own son's house and a doctor's appointment on my calendar that I intended to use like a scalpel rather than a shield. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. So I did the thing that had served me well for 24 years in a business built entirely on other people's worst assumptions about who was paying attention. I let them believe they were winning. Of begging for scraps of love. Marcus called twice that week, brisk and businesslike, the way you'd talk to a difficult client rather than a mother. "We just want to make sure you're okay out there alone," he'd say, and I'd tell him I was fine. Of begging for scraps of love, that the leaves were mostly raked, that I'd had a lovely lunch with Ruth Ann on Tuesday, none of which was a lie. Of begging for scraps of love, and all of which was designed to let him believe the woman on the other end of the line was exactly as unbothered and unaware as he needed her to be. Dana texted photographs of Sunset Maple's dining hall. Of begging for scraps of love. Captioned, "This could be so lovely for you, Mom," and I replied with a single thumbs up, the kind of non-committal gesture that could mean anything. And I watched over the following days, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, as their messages grew a little more relaxed, a little more confident, the way people always do when they believe the resistance they were braced for has quietly stopped coming. I have learned 10 years of begging for scraps of love, across a career built on watching people's faces when they think no one is reading them closely, that the moment someone believes they've already won is the exact moment they stop being careful. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Thanksgiving fell 12 days after that dinner at Cobble Ridge, and I want to tell you about it honestly because it wasn't part of anyone's plan, mine or theirs. For scraps of love, and it turned out to matter more than either side expected. Claire flew in Wednesday night, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, tired and a little raw around the edges from a conversation she'd apparently already had with her brother over the phone somewhere over the Midwest, of begging for scraps of love. One she wouldn't fully describe to me except to say that Marcus had told her I was being difficult about the whole thing, a word she repeated back to me with real disgust in her voice. For scraps of love. We spent Thursday at my house instead of theirs, a small, quiet dinner, just the two of us and Ruth Ann, who has had nowhere else to spend the holiday since her own husband passed and who has become, in the years since, of begging for scraps of love. Something closer to a sister than a friend. It was, without either of us intending it that way, exactly the kind of pause a person needs in the middle of a fight like this one. We didn't talk about the deed of trust, of begging for scraps of love, or Sunset Maple, or Porter Nash and his traffic cone blazer. We talked about Walter and about Ruth Ann's grandchildren and about a recipe for cranberry relish that had belonged to my mother and now lived 10 years of begging for scraps of love, appropriately enough, in the same cedar box as everything else that mattered. Claire cried a little over pie, not about any of it directly, just the particular ache of a holiday that felt smaller than it used to, of begging for scraps of love, and I held her hand across the table and thought, not for the first time, that whatever else this fight cost me, it had at least brought my daughter back into the same room as her own grief. The quiet didn't last, of begging for scraps of love. Of course, it never does. It was the following Monday at the grocery store on Danvers Street, reaching for a carton of the oat milk Josie liked, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that I understood exactly how far past confusion this whole thing had already gone. I heard Marcus's voice before I saw him 2 aisles over, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, not bothering to lower it the way people never do when they've forgotten the whole world isn't inside their own head. No. The capacity route is cleaner than trying to argue about the loan directly, he was saying, of beg for scraps of love. If we go the money angle, it gets complicated, lawyers arguing about a note nobody but her ever really understood anyway. If we go capacity, the house question resolves itself. Judge appoints a guardian, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Guardian makes the sensible financial decisions, problem solved. A second voice answered, smooth and confident, a voice I recognized instantly as belonging to a man in a traffic cone blazer. Trust me, Marcus, of begging for scraps of love. I've walked a dozen families through exactly this. Once the geriatrician's report is in and the petition's filed, most of this handles itself. Families come together, the judge does the rest. Of begging for scraps of love, we just formalize what everybody already privately agrees is true. I stood very still by the oat milk, my cart frozen in the middle of the aisle, of begging for scraps of love, and I let those words settle into me the way you let a bad diagnosis settle in before you decide how you're going to respond to it. If we go capacity, the house question resolves itself. For scraps of love. My son was not confused about the deed of trust. He understood on some level that the money question was dangerous ground, and he had chosen quite deliberately to root around it entirely, of begging for scraps of love, straight through a courtroom that would strip me of my legal capacity before anyone ever had to explain to a judge exactly what that acceleration clause would trigger. It was, I realized, of begging for scraps of love. Standing there with my hand still on a carton of oat milk, an almost elegant solution to a problem I hadn't even known he understood he had. If I were declared incapacitated by the court's own order, a guardian, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, likely Marcus himself would step into my financial affairs, and a guardian appointed by the court has considerable discretion over how and whether, of begging for scraps of love, an inconvenient private debt gets enforced against the very family managing the estate. He wasn't trying to avoid the clause. He was trying to make sure that by the time anyone thought to enforce it, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, he'd be the one holding the pen. Marcus rounded the corner of the aisle with his cart a moment later and nearly ran directly into mine. His face did something complicated when he saw me, a fast, years of begging for scraps of love, unconvincing rearrangement into pleasant surprise. "Mom, didn't expect to see you here." Beside him, Porter Nash offered me the same practiced, gentle smile he'd worn at Cobble Ridge, for scraps of love, lanyard swinging slightly as he extended a hand I did not take. "Funny running into you," I said, and I meant it a great deal more literally than either of them understood. "Mrs. Bellamy," Porter Nash said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I'd love the chance to sit down with you properly sometime. No pressure at all, just to listen to your concerns. You'd love to build a file on me," I said pleasantly. Begging for scraps of love. I understand the difference between those two sentences a great deal better than you might expect. His smile didn't flicker, and that, more than anything, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, told me exactly how good he was at this particular line of work. I pushed my cart past both of them toward the register, my hands entirely steady, and it wasn't until I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of begging for scraps of love, engine off, groceries still in the trunk, that I let myself feel the full weight of what I'd just overheard. They weren't hoping I'd get confused someday. They were actively building a case that I already was, of begging for scraps of love. Brick by careful brick, with a professional's help, on a timeline I hadn't yet been able to see the edges of. I called Miriam from the parking lot. It's of begging for scraps of love. They're pursuing a capacity petition specifically to avoid dealing with the note directly, I told her. Marcus said it out loud, standing 2 aisles over from me at the grocery store, of begging for scraps of love, like I wasn't even a person capable of hearing him. That's actually useful, Miriam said, and there was something almost pleased in her voice. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The particular satisfaction of a lawyer who has just been handed a gift she didn't have to go looking for. If they file that petition, and it fails, and it will fail, Eleanor, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Once we have Dr. Kagan's evaluation on record, that failed petition itself becomes evidence of bad faith. It strengthens your position on the note enormously. But I need to know their timeline. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Do you have any sense of when they intend to file? I didn't, not yet. But I knew someone who might. Josie came by 2 days later. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Still in the apron from her afternoon shift at the coffee shop where she works on weekends, her eyes red in a way that told me she'd been crying in the car before she came in. I found something, she said, of begging for scraps of love before I'd even gotten the door fully closed behind her. In Dad's office. I wasn't snooping, I swear. I was looking for the stapler. I poured her a glass of the oat milk I'd bought at Danvers Street and waited for scraps of. There's a folder, she said, a green one in his desk drawer, and it's got dates in it. Times he says you forgot things, times you got confused. Some of it's real, Grandma, like the hose thing. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but some of it's just not true. There's one that says you didn't recognize me at church in October, and Grandma, I wasn't even at church in October. I was at a debate tournament in Millbrook. 4 scraps of love. I sat down across from her at my kitchen table, the same table where Marcus had once asked me about deeds of trust, with his elbows resting exactly where Josie's were now. What else was in the folder? 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I asked her gently. There's a form, she said, her voice dropping. It looks like the start of some kind of petition. There's a blank spot where a judge signs. It's of begging for scraps of love. And there's a date circled on a calendar taped to the inside of the folder, December 9th, with a note next to it that says file before Christmas, clean transition, December 9th. Of begging for scraps of love. I did the math without even meaning to, the way 24 years of closings had trained me to do automatically with any deadline anyone ever put in front of me. 15 days. I had 15 days to be entirely of begging for scraps of love, undeniably, unimpeachably prepared. You did the right thing telling me, I said. Thank you, Josie. What are you going to do? She asked, and there was real fear in her voice now. Of begging for scraps of love. The particular fear of a 16-year-old who has just realized the adults around her are capable of things she hadn't thought possible. I'm going to let them keep building their file, I told her, of begging for scraps of love, and I'm going to make sure mine is the one a judge actually believes. She frowned at that, the way Ivy might have frowned in a story that isn't mine, the frustration of a young person who wants action, not patience. Begging for scraps of love. That's it? You're just going to wait? I smiled at her, and I thought of Walter. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and of a line I'd carried in my chest for 24 working years and had never once expected to need this badly outside of a professional context. Paper remembers what people would rather forget, I told her. Of begging for scraps of love, I'm going to let the paper do the remembering. Watch. Dr. Kagan's results came back that Thursday, 3 days before the deadline Josie had found circled on a stolen calendar page. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I sat in the same office where I'd had my flu shots for 11 years and listened to a woman in a white coat read in a flat, clinical, wonderfully unremarkable voice of begging for scraps of love, exactly the sentence I needed a judge to someday hear. Cognition intact across all domains, Dr. Kagan read from the sealed, signed report. Memory, executive function, judgment, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and processing speed all within normal or above normal range for age. I'd testify to this in any courtroom in the state, Eleanor, and I'd do it without hesitation. You may have to, I told her. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and she slid the report across her desk toward me the way you'd hand someone a shield you hope they'd never actually need to raise. Of begging for scraps of love. I drove home that afternoon with the report on the passenger seat where the cedar box had ridden 3 weeks earlier, and I thought the whole way about a phrase Miriam had used on the phone. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. A failed petition itself becomes evidence of bad faith. I understood, finally sitting at a red light 2 blocks from Larch Street, exactly what shape my next move needed to take. I wasn't only defending myself anymore, begging for scraps of love. I was building deliberately a record clean enough and clear enough that when the moment came to reveal it, there would be no ambiguity left for anyone in that family to hide inside. That Saturday, of begging for scraps of love, 5 days before the deadline, I invited Marcus to come by the house alone. Just us, I told him on the phone. No lawyers, no Porter Nash, mother and son. He agreed almost too quickly, and I understood. Of begging for scraps of love, listening to the relief in his voice that he believed he was finally about to get what he'd been circling toward for 2 months, a mother worn down enough to sign whatever was put in front of her. Of begging for scraps of love. He arrived Saturday afternoon in his work truck, still in the boots he wore on job sites, and sat across from me at the same kitchen table where he'd once asked me about deeds of trust, and where, 3 weeks earlier, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, his daughter had shown me a green folder full of dates that didn't hold up to the truth. "Mom, this is happening," he said before I'd even finished pouring the coffee. "You're 71. The house is a lot. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Dana and I have found a wonderful place, and honestly, at this point, we think it's better for everyone if we handle this before the holidays get more complicated." "Handle it," I repeated. "It's of begging for scraps of love. That's an interesting choice of word for what you're describing." "You know what I mean." "I know exactly what you mean," I said, and I set my coffee cup down with a small, deliberate click against the saucer. "I'd like to ask you something, Marcus, and I'd like an honest answer, if you're capable of giving me one at this point. Do you remember the promissory note you signed 3 years ago at this exact table? 10 years of begging for scraps of love." Something flickered across his face, fast, there and gone. "That's not relevant to this conversation." "It's entirely relevant," I said. "You asked me at this table for scraps of love, to explain how a private note secured by a deed of trust would work. I explained it to you. I had it drawn up properly by a real attorney, the same one who's handling my estate right now, as it happens. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It was recorded at the courthouse the week your foundation went in. $210,000, Marcus. Did you ever read the whole document? It's of begging for scraps of love. Or did you sign it on the last page the way you do with subcontractor agreements and hope the middle pages didn't matter?" He didn't answer right away, and in the silence, I watched him understand, for the first time, of begging for scraps of love, that this conversation was not go the way he'd walked in expecting. "I read it," he said finally, though I could hear in his voice that he was lying. Of begging for scraps of love, or at best remembering only the parts that had felt comfortable at the time. "Then you'll remember the acceleration clause," I said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The one that says if either party to that note is found by a court to lack capacity to manage their own financial affairs, the entire remaining balance becomes due immediately, and I, as the beneficiary of begging for scraps of love, have every right under that deed of trust to pursue foreclosure on the property securing it. The color left his face slowly, the way it does when a person is doing arithmetic they very much do not want to be doing. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "That's not what this is about," he said, but his voice had lost the confident, businesslike edge from a moment before. "Isn't it?" I said. "Because I overheard you at the grocery store on Monday, Marcus, of begging for scraps of love, standing 2 aisles from me with your consultant, explaining exactly why the capacity route was cleaner than dealing with, and I believe I'm quoting you correctly, the money angle. You're not confused about that clause, of begging for scraps of love. You're trying to make sure that by the time anyone thinks to enforce it, you'll be the one with legal authority over how it gets handled." He stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. "Of begging for scraps of love. You don't understand what kind of pressure we're under," he said, and for one brief moment, something real broke through the careful performance. Of begging for scraps of love. Something that sounded less like manipulation and more like a man genuinely drowning. "The lawsuit ate everything, Mom. Every dollar. We had to finish that house. We'd already sunk everything into it. And if we don't, of begging for scraps of love, if the bank's back around asking questions about the gap financing, we lose it all anyway. I didn't want it to be like this. I just needed it to be over." For a moment, just a moment, I felt something soften in me, of begging for scraps of love, the old reflex, the instinct to reach across the table and rescue my son from a hole he'd dug for himself, the way I'd rescued him quietly 3 years earlier and asked for nothing in return. I let that instinct rise, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and then I let it pass the way you let a wave pass over your feet at the shoreline without letting it pull you back out with it. I understand pressure, Marcus, I said quietly. I understand it better than you know. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I buried your father alone. I built a career reading fine print for people exactly like you, people desperate enough to sign something they hadn't fully read because the alternative felt worse in the moment. Begging for scraps of love. I understand desperation intimately. What I will not do, not for you, not for anyone, is let desperation excuse what you were about to do to me. So what happens now, he asked, and his voice had gone quiet, of begging for scraps of love. Almost young, the voice of the boy who used to ask if he could borrow the car. Now, I said, you go home and you tell your consultant to cancel whatever he's got planned for December 9th. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because if that petition gets filed, I will show up to that courtroom with a sealed neuropsychological evaluation, a recorded deed of trust with an acceleration clause your own attorney drafted, of begging for scraps of love, and a witness who overheard you at a grocery store explaining exactly why you chose that particular strategy. And once that petition fails, which it will, the note becomes a very different kind of problem for you, of begging them for scraps of love, because a judge will have just watched you try in bad faith to use the machinery of the court to seize your own mother's house rather than repay a debt you owe her fair and square. He stood there a long moment, years of begging for scraps of love, hands braced on the back of the kitchen chair he'd nearly knocked over, and I watched something shift behind his eyes, not quite remorse yet, not quite understanding, for scraps of love, but the first flicker of a man realizing the ground he was standing on was not nearly as solid as he'd believed. And if I withdraw it, he said slowly, what happens to the note? Then we talk, I said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, like two adults with a real, difficult, honest problem to solve, instead of one adult trying to erase the other one from the record. That offer is still on the table, Marcus. It has been the entire time. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You're the one who chose not to take it. He left without another word, and I sat alone at my kitchen table a long while afterward, the coffee gone cold, the cedar box sitting closed on the counter where I'd left it, of begging for scraps of love, its hinge silent for once, and I thought, not for the first time, how strange it was that the $210,000 I'd lent my son out of love had become, without my ever intending it, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the single most powerful piece of leverage either of us had left. I believed that Saturday evening that I might have actually reached him. I want you to understand that because it matters for what came next. Of begging for scraps of love, I believed for almost 4 full days that my son had heard me, of begging for scraps of love, that whatever desperate calculation had brought him to that dining table with a brochure and a consultant might finally be giving way to something closer to honesty. I was wrong, of begging for scraps of love, and I found out exactly how wrong on the morning of December 9th when Dana called to tell me, in a voice bright and rehearsed as a sponsored post, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that the whole family would be gathering that Sunday at the new house at Cobble Ridge to make, in her words, one final loving decision together. They gathered on a Sunday afternoon, 10 days before Christmas, of begging for scraps of love, in the vaulted great room of a house that $210,000 of my own dollars had helped build. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and not one of them understood yet that the box sitting in my lap held the exact instrument that could either save that house or take it from them. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and that the choice of which one happened depended entirely on what they said to me in the next hour. I want to walk you through that room carefully because every detail in it mattered by the time it was over. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Marcus and Dana on the leather sofa nearest the fireplace, angled slightly toward each other the way people sit when they've rehearsed a scene together, of begging for scraps of love. Gail perched on the arm of a wingback chair with a glass of white wine she hadn't touched. 2 cousins from Dana's side I barely knew, invited, I suspected, of begging for scraps of love. less for family closeness than for the size of the audience their presence would provide. Porter Nash, in a fresh blazer, this one a slightly more subdued shade of orange, of begging for scraps of love, seated at the small writing desk near the window with a leather portfolio open in front of him, like a man preparing to close a very ordinary sale, and Claire, who had flown back for the second time in 3 weeks, of begging for scraps of love, sitting quietly in the corner near the bookshelf, notebook in her lap, exactly where Miriam and I had asked her to sit. Josie stood by the window the entire time, arms crossed, for scraps of love, refusing the offer of a seat closer to the group, and I understood that as its own kind of statement, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the position of a young woman who had already decided which side of this room she belonged to and wanted everyone else to see it clearly. I brought the cedar box. Of course I brought the cedar box. Of begging for scraps of love. I set it on the coffee table in front of me, closed, the way you'd set down a hand of cards you weren't ready to show yet, and I let the room settle into an expectant, slightly nervous quiet before anyone spoke. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Marcus went first, the way I'd expected him to, his voice carefully gentle, rehearsed in that particular way of a man performing patience he did not actually feel. Mom, we're not here to gang up on you. Years of begging for scraps of love. We're here because we love you, and because Porter's helped us put together a plan that we think really works for everyone. A voluntary transition agreement, Porter Nash said, of begging for scraps of love, sliding 2 documents across the coffee table toward me, a pen resting neatly on top of the smaller one. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way it had been resting on top of a very different set of documents on a very different table 3 weeks earlier. And a healthcare authorization, naming Marcus as your primary decision-maker going forward, of begging for scraps of love. We just need your signature, Mrs. Bellamy, and everyone in this room can stop worrying. Sign it, Mom, Marcus said, and his voice cracked in a place that might have moved me once, of begging for scraps of love, before I'd learned to listen for the difference between a crack born of feeling and a crack rehearsed to sound like one. Please, before this gets any harder than it has to be, and if I don't, Dana said, for scraps of love. Before I'd even had the chance to answer, her voice suddenly flatter, colder, the mask slipping just slightly. Then Porter's already prepared the paperwork for the alternative. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. We'll let a judge decide whether you're fit to keep making these decisions on your own. The room went very quiet. A cousin murmured something that sounded like it's for the best, Eleanor, of begging for scraps of love, and I let that quiet sit a moment longer than was comfortable for anyone else in it, because I have learned across 24 years that silence does more work than any sentence you could put in its place, of begging for scraps of love. I looked at the 2 documents on the coffee table. I looked at the pen, placed so helpfully. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, pointing toward the rest of my life the way a closing agent points toward the line where your whole future gets decided in a single signature. And then I set my hand flat on the lid of the cedar box, of begging for scraps of love, and I let the hinge give its small, familiar creak into the silence of that beautiful room, and I watched every single person's eyes come to that sound at once. I'm not signing anything today, I said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. My hand didn't shake, and I noticed that, the way you notice a small mercy in the middle of a difficult day. After 24 years of watching other people's hands shake across closing tables, mine, begging for scraps of love at the one moment it mattered most, was perfectly steady. Mom, but since everyone's here, I said, and since we're apparently making one final loving decision together, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I'd like to make sure everyone in this room has the same information before anyone decides anything at all. I opened the box, the hinge creaked that same tired, familiar sound, and I lifted out the first document, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I did not unfold it yet. I wanted one breath of plain honesty in that room before the proof arrived to back it up. You all think this is about a house, I said, looking around the circle of faces, of begging for scraps of love. Cousins and Gail and Porter Nash and my own son and his wife. It isn't. It's about a word, capacity. My son and his wife have decided, with the help of a man they're paying by the hour, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that I no longer have the capacity to manage my own life. So, let's talk about capacity. Let's talk about whose exactly was actually in question this whole time. Marcus's jaw tightened. Mom, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Don't do this in front of everyone. You brought everyone, I said. I'm simply going to make sure everyone gets the truth instead of the version you've been circulating. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I unfolded the first document and turned it so the room could see it, the way you'd turn a chain of title toward a nervous buyer at closing. This is a promissory note, I said, dated 3 years ago. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, signed by Marcus Bellamy and Dana Bellamy in the amount of $210,000, secured against this house, this exact house we are all sitting in right now. I lent my son that money quietly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, without asking a single member of this family for credit because his construction business had nearly failed, and he was too proud to ask for help any other way. I never mentioned it again. I never sent a reminder. For scraps of love, I trusted that quiet was a kindness. Dana's face had gone very still. That's not, Marcus, is that true? I'm not finished, I said, and lifted the second document. For scraps of love. This is the deed of trust that secures that note, recorded at the county courthouse the same week your foundation went in. My name is listed on it as beneficiary, which means of begging for scraps of love, contrary to whatever anyone in this room may have believed walking in today. I am not merely a mother you're trying to relocate for her own good. I am legally begging for scraps of love. A creditor with a recorded interest in the house you're currently sitting in, a cousin gasped softly. Gail set her wine glass down with a small, startled clink. This is insane, Dana said, standing now. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, her voice climbing toward the brittle register I remembered so well from a story that isn't quite mine but felt in that moment like it could have been. She's confused. Of begging for scraps of love. She's making up some story about owning our house. I'm not claiming to own your house, Dana, I said, calm as still water. I'm telling you I hold a lien against it, which is an entirely different thing. Of begging for scraps of love, and which is a fact, not a story, because facts don't require your belief to remain true. Porter Nash had gone very quiet at the writing desk. I watched him lean forward slightly, reading upside down, as of begging for scraps of love, the particular posture of a man who had suddenly realized the deal he'd been paid to close was not the one actually on the table. And here, I said, lifting the third document, of begging for scraps of love, is the clause I imagine none of you have ever seen, because I don't believe my son ever read past the signature line. I read it aloud, slowly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way I'd once read it to myself at my kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold. In the event that either party to this note is determined to lack legal capacity to manage their financial affairs, of begging for scraps of love, whether by court order or by certified medical evaluation, the full remaining balance of the note becomes immediately due and payable, and the beneficiary may pursue any remedy available under the deed of trust, begging for scraps of love, including but not limited to foreclosure. The room did not gasp this time. It went entirely perfectly still. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the specific stillness of a group of people simultaneously understanding the exact shape of the trap they had built for someone else and then walked into themselves. So let me be very clear about what happens next. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I said, because I think it's important everyone here understands the actual stakes before anyone signs anything else today. If you succeed in having me declared incapable of managing my own affairs, for scraps of love, that note becomes due in full immediately. $210,000, Marcus. Do you have that? Because I don't believe you do, and if you don't, under this deed of trust, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I have the legal right to foreclose on this house, the one you built to replace the life you'd already decided wasn't good enough anymore. Marcus sat frozen on the leather sofa. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, his face gone the color of the fresh paint on his own walls. You wouldn't, he said, but there was no real conviction left in it, only the thin of begging for scraps of love, desperate hope of a man asking a question he already suspected he knew the answer to. I don't want to, I said. I have never once wanted to. I lent you that money because I loved you and because I believed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Foolishly, that love shown quietly would eventually be understood without me having to ask for credit. I was wrong about that. I have been wrong about that my whole life with more than one of my children, of begging for scraps of love, and I am done being wrong about it. I set the papers down on the table and I lifted out the fourth item from the cedar box, the sealed report from Dr. Kagan, and I held it up so the room could see the letterhead. For scraps of love. Cognition intact across all domains, I read aloud. No evidence of impairment. Signed, dated, and sealed 11 days ago. 10 years of begging for scraps of love by a physician who has treated me for over a decade and who has offered to testify to this personally in any courtroom in this state. Your petition, Marcus, the one your consultant was preparing to file this week, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, is built on a green folder full of dates and details that do not hold up. I did not fail to recognize my own granddaughter at church in October. I was not at church in October. Begging for scraps of love. Josie was at a debate tournament in Millbrook that entire weekend, a fact easily verified, a fact that will make your entire file look, to any judge, exactly like what it is. Josie by the window, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, had tears sliding freely down her face now, but she didn't move, didn't say a word, just stood there like a witness, exactly the role she'd asked to play. Porter Nash closed his leather portfolio quietly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the small click of it loud in that silent room, and I watched him understand, faster than anyone else present, that whatever fee he'd already collected was the last one he was going to see from this particular family. Of begging for scraps of love, Mrs. Bellamy, he began, I think perhaps we should. You don't get to speak in this house right now, Mr. Nash, I said, not unkindly, simply factually. You're a guest here, same as I am, and I'd like to finish. Of begging for love. I reached for the last document in the box, and this one I did not hold up right away. I let it sit in my lap a moment, and I looked around the room at the faces still absorbing everything they'd just heard, of begging for scraps of love, and I said the thing I had been carrying inside me since the night I'd found Walter's note card in his sock drawer. My husband left me 8 words the night he died, I said. Guard the name, guard your home, of begging for scraps of love. I have spent 6 years trying to live up to those words, and for most of that time I believed they meant something simple. Protect this house on Larch Street. Keep his memory safe in it. Of begging for scraps of love, I understand now they meant something larger than that. They meant don't let anyone, not even the people you love most in this world, of begging for scraps of love, convince you that your name on a document doesn't matter anymore just because it's inconvenient for them. I unfolded the last page, a letter, the one thing in that box I had never shown to a single living soul, of begging for scraps of love. Written by Walter 4 months before he died, when a routine test had come back with a scare that turned out, thank God, to be nothing. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but had frightened him enough to sit down one evening and write a letter he never told me existed until I found it, folded inside his fishing license envelope, 3 years after his funeral. For scraps of love. If any of you ever try to make her doubt herself, I read, my voice steady though something in my chest had gone tight, you tell them Walter said no, begging for scraps of love. She built half of everything we have with her own 2 hands and her own good judgment. Years of begging for scraps of love, and there isn't a soul on this earth who gets to decide she's stopped being capable of it just because it's easier for them if she has. The room was silent when I finished. Even Dana, I noticed, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, had stopped reaching for her phone. Marcus, I said, folding the letter carefully and setting it back in the box. Your father wrote that 4 months before he died, without ever telling me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because some part of him already suspected a day like today might come. I don't believe he imagined it would be you sitting across from me when it did, but here we are. Marcus put his face in his hands. Of begging for scraps of love, when he looked up again, something had genuinely broken open in him, not performed, not rehearsed, the real thing this time. I didn't want it to be like this, he said, his voice cracking for real now. Of begging for scraps of love. The lawsuit took everything, Mom, and then the gap in the financing, and I thought if we could just get you somewhere safe, somewhere taken care of. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the house question would resolve itself, and I wouldn't have to keep looking you in the eye knowing I owed you money I couldn't pay back. You could have told me that, I said quietly. Any day in the last 3 years. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You could have sat at my kitchen table the way you did the first time, and told me the truth, and we would have found a way through it together, the way families are supposed to. of begging for scraps of love. Instead, you tried to erase me from my own life to avoid a conversation you were afraid to have. I know, he said, and for the first time in weeks, I believed him. Dana did not soften the way her husband had. Of begging for scraps of love. This is absurd, she said, gathering her purse from the side table, her voice climbing back toward its rehearsed brightness, brittle now at the edges. You're twisting a private family loan into some kind of attack. Of begging for scraps of love. We were trying to help you, Eleanor, and this is how you repay it, by threatening to take our home. I'm not threatening anything, Dana, I said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I'm telling you the truth about the consequences of the plan you and your husband set in motion. If you'd like the note repaid on reasonable terms, quietly, the way any family debt should be handled, years of begging for scraps of love, that offer has never once left the table. If you'd like to file that petition anyway on December 9th as planned, you're welcome to try. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and we'll let a judge decide who in this room understands the meaning of the word capacity. She didn't have an answer for that. Nobody did. It was Claire, from the corner, who spoke next, of begging for scraps of love, closing her notebook with a small deliberate motion. I think, she said, we should all agree that no petition gets filed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I think Marcus and Dana should sit down with Mom's attorney this week and work out a repayment plan on the note. And I think, she added, looking at her brother with something that had, until that afternoon, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, been entirely absent from their relationship for years, real steadiness, that you should have called me the day the lawsuit hit instead of 3 years and a fake nursing home brochure later. Marcus nodded. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Unable to speak, Porter Nash rose quietly from the writing desk and let himself out without another word, and I never heard from Golden Years transition partners again. Of begging for scraps of love. I want to tell you honestly that the room did not erupt into forgiveness that afternoon. It didn't. Dana left within the hour, cold and unreachable. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the kind of departure that tells you more about how much repair is still ahead than any argument could. But Marcus stayed. He sat across from me at the coffee table long after the cousins had made their quiet of begging for scraps of love. Embarrassed exits, and we talked, really talked, for the first time in longer than either of us wanted to admit, about the lawsuit, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, about the fear that had driven him toward a plan so desperate he'd been willing to erase his own mother's legal existence rather than say the words, "I'm in trouble and I don't know how to fix it." Here is how it landed. Of begging for scraps of love, in the plain particular numbers I trust more than any apology. Marcus and Dana worked out a repayment schedule with Miriam within 2 weeks, 18 months, modest monthly payments for scraps of love. Secured still by that same deed of trust, only now with both of us fully understanding every clause inside it, the petition was never filed. Of begging for scraps of love. You do not bring a capacity case against a woman holding a sealed neuropsychological evaluation and a green folder full of dates that don't hold up to a single fact check. Porter Nash's agency, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I later learned from Ruth Ann, who hears everything, eventually quietly stopped taking new clients in our county the following spring, of begging for scraps of love after 2 other families filed complaints about petitions built on similarly thin ground. Josie spent that Christmas at my house on Larch Street instead of Cobble Ridge by her own choice, of begging for scraps of love, and helped me restring the lights on the same maple tree her grandfather used to climb a ladder for every December of his life. Claire flew home twice more that winter, unprompted. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and started calling on Sundays instead of only holidays, a small change that meant more to me than she probably understood. Dana and I have not fully repaired what broke that Sunday afternoon. Of begging for scraps of love. She sent one message in January, long and polished, insisting she had only ever wanted what was best for the family, with no real apology folded anywhere inside it. I read it once. I didn't answer. It's of begging for scraps of love. Some messages don't deserve a reply, only a closed lid. I took the cedar box home that evening, back to Larch Street, back to the hall table where it has sat for 6 years and will go on sitting. I expect 10 years of begging for scraps of love, for as many more as I'm given. I put the note card back inside it, and the letter and the note and its deed of trust, folded now with a repayment schedule clipped neatly to the front. Years of begging for scraps of love. The record of a family debt finally being handled the honest way it should have been handled from the very start. The hinge gave its small, familiar creak when I closed the lid, the sound I have known my whole life. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the sound of something precious being kept safe rather than thrown away. Guard the name, I told the quiet house that night. Guard your home. I had done both. I hadn't lost either one. Of begging for scraps of love, and for the first time in 6 years sitting alone in a kitchen that had once felt big and now simply felt like mine, I understood that Walter's 8 words had never actually been about a house at all. They had been about exactly this, about a woman refusing to let anyone, family included, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, convince her that her name on a document had stopped meaning something just because it had become inconvenient for someone else to remember it was there. Of begging for scraps of love. If this reminded you to read the fine print on every kindness you've ever quietly given away, do it this week. Check the paperwork, ask the hard question before you sign the easy answer. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Share this with someone who needs to hear that the quiet ones are usually the ones who were paying the closest attention all along.